Hi everyone. In this video, I'll be interviewing Kristina Dooley, President of the Independent Educational Consultants Association. Today, we're speaking about how letters of recommendation can help your college application. Kristina, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, starting with the big question, how important are recommendation letters in college admissions? Can they make or break a candidate's chances of being admitted to the school of their dreams?
That's a really good question and one that we get a lot. I think recommendation letters, the best way to look at it is it's an opportunity for students to become multidimensional in the process. It's not a numeric data point. And so it's the one way that students can really have some of their personality traits come through, obviously by, the words of a recommender. In terms of can they make or break an applicant, I think they can certainly break an applicant if the words are not as positive, and which I think students are sometimes surprised that when they ask somebody to write a letter of recommendation for them, and the students won't see them because they'll waive their verbal rights to that. And so it is possible that a teacher who they feel like would write some really great things about them could have some reservations about their candidacy. And so certainly if the teacher writes something or if there's some red flags raised in it, it could break in terms of candidates' possibilities for admission. There's a space on there that the teacher can check a box that says, I'd like a phone call from the admission officer. Maybe they're not comfortable putting in writing something or a concern. So students should be aware of that. Can it make their application? It could certainly, I would say, support the already great things in their application. It won't be one thing that makes a candidate automatically admissible who, based on grades and other factors, is not admissible, but it's great supporting evidence for sure.
What is the purpose of looking at letters of recommendation in the college admissions process? What do admissions officers gain by reading them?
When admission representatives or admission committees are looking at recommendations, what they're really looking for is how can they shape that student? How can they make, again, that student be more than just numbers, or just letter grades? I think that's something that's really important. It is where the opportunity comes in to explain things about their character traits. A student also doesn't necessarily have to be the top student in a class to get a really strong recommendation from a teacher, because the teacher might actually be able to say, the student is incredibly prepared for class. They're so supportive of their peers. They are motivated. Some of those kinds of things that an admission committee may not otherwise know those things. And they may make their own assumptions without those things. If they see a B or a C in a class, a recommendation from the teacher who taught that class can actually maybe put some context into what that student is like in the class. And again, maybe their performance isn't indicated very well by just that letter grade.
So who should students reach out to write their recommendation letters? Do you have any tips on how students can make that decision?
I would say there's two different ways to think about this. One would be if a student is looking at a very specific academic program, let's say engineering, it would make a lot of sense for that student to look for recommendations coming from teachers who have taught them in something like math or science, because the admission committee would want to make sure, okay, this student will be able to be successful in our program. And that could come from some recommendations from those specific kinds of teachers. But otherwise, if a student's looking at applying to a college and maybe just looking at a general liberal arts curriculum or something like that, they typically would like to see recommendations coming from teachers from different types of disciplines. So maybe somebody from the sciences or math, and then on the other side, somebody from the humanities, English, history, something like that. So I tell students, choose from those two spectrums if you can, and ask for one of each, because again, it gives a little bit more breadth to the descriptions of the student and what they can do. But again, if they're looking at really something specific, especially math or science based, it is very important that they get a recommendation from a teacher in one of those preferably higher level math or science classes, in my opinion. The other set of recommendations that students can get, which colleges, depending on the college, may or may not ask for, are optional letters from people who are not teachers. And that's something I tell students, The college says you can have, 2 or 3 optional letters of recommendation, and that student is very active, for example, in their church, and maybe their youth group leader could write a character reference letter recommendation. Absolutely take advantage of that. Maybe it's a coach, maybe it's an academic advisor, a tutor. There's lots of people that can provide supplemental information who haven't necessarily taught that student in a class, but they can provide some of that other information about what the student's like, just on a personality basis even.
How early should students be reaching out?
That's a really good question, because I think there's some confusion around that. What I encourage our students to do is in the spring of their junior year, before they leave for their summer break, I will tell the students, you know what, this is the time to do the ask. This is kind of the promposal, it's we're not going yet, but let's ask and get on their radar, because there are always very popular teachers in high schools who get asked by many students to write letters of recommendation. And it's common for teachers to say, I will write them for the first 10 or 15 or 20 students that ask me, but beyond that, I just don't have the capacity. So getting into their queue and getting on their radar in terms of writing the recommendation is important. So I have them do the ask in the spring before they leave for the summer. And then towards the end of the summer, beginning of the school year, the students should be reaching back out to the teacher as a reminder, thank you again for offering to, or for agreeing to write a letter of recommendation for me. A lot of teachers will try to get their recommendation letters written over the summer months or early in the fall semester, because obviously once students get into school, and the teachers' schedules will get very full. So that early ask in spring of junior year is imperative, because if the teachers can get them written, boy, does that save them some time in the fall, so they're not having to do that all at one time. But the actual submission, obviously, it's not happening till the fall of senior year, but it doesn't mean wait until that time to ask. Do it far in advance of that.
Once a student gets confirmation from someone who is willing to write a rec letter, what are the appropriate next steps? Should that student speak to the rec writer about what he or she should include in that letter? Or are there any documents or information that students should provide?
I think you'll find that some teachers will ask specifically for the student to provide them with a resume or a brag sheet of some sort. Some of them actually have a form that they have students complete. I know a lot of counselors do that as well, so that they can be sure to touch on the things that the student really feels are important for them to bring up in the recommendation. All that being said, I do think there's something to be said about a very genuine, authentic letter of recommendation that doesn't have talking points already provided. So I think depending on the teacher, they may just, because if they're one of those teachers writing 15 or 20 recommendations, it could be very helpful to have some guidelines, or some reference points so that could help them, so that those letters don't become generic from one student to the other. And in fact, we do that with our students. Our students do an aptitudes assessment that has a one-page sheet that has some terms to describe me. And we have our students provide that to their teachers if they'd like to use it, if they'd like to use some of those terms in their letter of recommendation. And many of them do. And I think they find that helpful. But to actually tell the teacher, I want you to mention that I was the debate champion last year. I want you to mention about that big game last fall when we won against, school, whatever. I think that makes them a little less authentic. So again, I think the teachers, while you can provide them some information and could be helpful, a resume is helpful because they may not know necessarily what you're doing outside of school. So they may not know that you have a job, or maybe that you've participated again in something like a youth group or an outside organization or sport. And so it does give them some context in terms of what you're doing outside of school, but they should be writing based on their direct knowledge about who you are and their direct experiences with you, not repeating things that you're going to be talking about in other parts of your application that really don't have anything to do with that specific teacher's experience with that student. The admission reps want to know about that piece of it. We don't need a summary or a cliff notes of what they've done outside of school if you don't really have any experience working with them in that capacity.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And for more interviews like this, please subscribe. Have a great day, everyone.